the rule of social media is the same as the rule of improv, right? Because we're already off script. Like, we don't have the science to back up like a tenth of the claims that is made on social media. But what you do is, the rule of improv is yes and. As in, someone gives you a statement, and then you say, yes, you're right. And here's my other statement. And if someone says to you, peptides are the new thing, you say, yes, I love your peptides protocol. Also, look at my new bull testosterone protocol. These two things work together great. And so you just build on bullshit. Someone lays down a piece of bullshit and you put your bullshit on top of it. And now 2 social media followings are agreeing that you have to inject your bullshit with peptides and then eat it. And then and then both people's followings grow.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Smarter Not Harder podcast, your home to one-cent solutions to life's $64,000 questions. I'm your host today, Boomer Anderson, and before we get started with today's conversation, if you're watching this on YouTube, please click like and subscribe. Leave a comment if you want. Or if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast. My guest on today's show is Scott Carney. He's a New York Times bestselling author, anthropologist, and investigative journalist. And he's somebody who I've known for quite a bit of time. And in previous discussions, I've talked to him about his books, The Wedge, as well as What Doesn't Kill Us. But today's conversation is a little bit different. We go into another one of his books called The Enlightenment Trap. And we start today's conversation off by going into Scott's writing process. How does something go from idea to story to book? The second part of this conversation delves a little bit more into a controversial topic, spirituality and the pursuit of enlightenment. And specifically here, we talk about how one can go wrong on what is a pursuit of an otherwise noble path. We talk about some of the dangers that come with this path and some of the gurus, and historically, some of the bad things some of these gurus have done. That's not to say all gurus are bad, of course. And then finally, we close off with a little bit of an interesting conversation on the relationship between the dark side of spirituality and that pursuit of enlightenment. Again, we're emphasizing the dark side here, and the kind of correlation, or I guess you can say similarities, to some of the personalities that are in the health world right now and what that means for you. We talk about cognitive biases, of course, and why just acknowledging those may give us a little bit of a breath of fresh air. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with my friend Scott Carney. Again, please feel free to subscribe or like on YouTube, as well as download and subscribe on Apple or Spotify. Let's get on with the show. Scott Carney, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to talk to you again.
Yeah, the last time I saw you, it was actually in your part of the world, Colorado, in a much nicer weather situation than I imagine Colorado is right now. So
it's beautiful today, but yeah, in general.
Today we're going to dig a little bit into one of your books called The Enlightenment Trap, but I wanted, because you and I have had multiple conversations, but I don't think I've ever really asked you this. What serves as inspiration for you to kind of go down these various wormholes that you've gone down? And the reason why I bring that up is for those who haven't read a lot of your books. You've got a book on climate change. You've got a book on like bone collecting and human trafficking for all intents and purposes. You've gone down the route of the Wim Hof method and some of your experiences with that and What Doesn't Kill Us. And then you also have The Wedge. And now you have this book, or you had this book, which you're now talking about a little bit more, called The Enlightenment Trap. And so for a guy like you, where does the, for lack of a better phrase, or maybe this is kind of funny given the topic today, where's the divine inspiration come from?
I mean, there's a flippant answer and there's sort of a real answer here. The flippant answer is I'm intensely ADD and I just cannot just stick onto one small, narrow topic my whole life. I need to dig in. So that's the flippant answer. The real answer is the fundamental question that I'm trying to answer in my life is, what does it mean to be a human? Right? We're born into this world. We have this complex, crazy environment that we live in, and there's no right or wrong answers for anything. And we're cross-cut by an economic system that is polarizing and exploitative. We live in, we have a climate that's going out of control, and we have religious and spiritual inclinations that detach us from reality and make us believe that there's something greater than ourselves, and then that influences our actions, which then reflect in the real world. And my instigating incident for probably all of my books, all of my mainstream books, was an event back in 2006 when I was leading an abroad program for American college students. I just dropped out of my anthropology PhD, and I was like sort of in between. I was like a 26-year-old guy, and I was leading this abroad program in North India. We ended up at a meditation retreat, and on the last day of the retreat, the sort of the best and brightest student that I had climbed up to the roof of the retreat center and jumped off headfirst, committing suicide. And I was responsible for bringing her body back to America and understanding what happened. I was also the only person who spoke Hindi in the group, so I was also the liaison with the police and that sort of stuff. And what her journal said was, I am a bodhisattva, which means like I am an enlightened Tibetan angel. I'm on the, I am, the reason she killed herself was not because she was depressed. It was because she wanted to stay in that moment of bliss you get in intensive meditation techniques, and she thought the only way to do it was to take her own life. That moment instigates basically everything that I've written since then. My book on organ trafficking, so I traveled the world for 6 years looking at how people buy and sell body parts, stems directly from me dealing with her body and trying to preserve it in the 106-degree heat, where all these stakeholders come out of the woodwork asking for pieces of her body in different ways. And I suddenly realized that there's this difference between the material reality of your body and like sort of what happens when you're embodied and you're alive. And humans become meat when we die. And then how we deal with the meat has this whole social life that we do not talk about in the West because we are so afraid of talking about death. And then when commercial enterprises get involved, I took the segue into understanding the buying and selling of human body parts, kidneys, hair, skeletons, all these things. That was my book, The Red Market. And that was looking at like what happens when the body doesn't have a soul in it anymore. And then this next book that I wrote was called The Enlightenment Trap, which is basically why Emily O'Connor took her own life by jumping off the roof of this retreat center. Like, what was it about that spiritual moment that made her decide that she had to leave her body? And that like starts off this whole thing with the Enlightenment Trap, and where I start looking at false gurus, the allure of spiritual insight, how when you start realizing things, how that becomes more real than what you actually literally see and feel in front of you. And then this segued into my book, What Doesn't Kill Us, which is about, and also the follow-up, The Wedge. These books are about meeting this guy named Wim Hof. I was the first person to write about him, and he's this, people probably already know who Wim Hof is on your show, but basically he's this ice guru, sits in cold water and controls body temperature. I was going to debunk him just like I had with all the people in the Enlightenment Trap, but it turned out that his method worked. So I had to grapple with the fact that, some of these seemingly spiritual pursuits actually have really awesome and useful benefits. So that's been like another 10-year journey after dealing with Emily's death. And, it sort of goes on and on and on. It's like I follow one topic to another, I try to stay interested in stuff.
Yeah. So Scott, before we get into the Emily situation and specifically the Enlightenment Trap, I have to imagine in your position, like, is it just oftentimes difficult getting somebody to talk to you? Because these people you're approaching in certain cases when it comes to the guru or, the witness of something that was terribly tragic, they may
Mm-hmm.
not want to talk to you. And so how do you go about, I've always wanted to ask somebody more like an
Mm-hmm.
investigative journalist like yourself, like, how do you go about sourcing this information? Because it's not exactly easy.
Sometimes you can't. I mean, there's lots of people who don't talk to you. Uh, you know, people get scared and don't want to tell the truth for a number of reasons. And the job of an investigative journalist is to say, when you hit a dead end, find where you can get information in another way. So it's a very, very difficult job, and there's no trick to it, right? There's no, like, it's not like an investigative journalist has a special superpower, access to some sort of government database. What we do is we just start poking at things until something falls out. And so if someone doesn't want to talk to me, it's fine. Then I'll talk to their friends. I'll look at government records. I'll look at whatever I can to get the information that I need. But when you do have somebody who doesn't want to talk to you, who has like a reason not to talk to you, but you've landed an interview, what my technique is to try to empathize with them, try to understand why they think that they're a good person. So when I was interviewing organ traffickers or mob bosses or warlords, that was for my magazine career, I would getting the interview was usually very difficult. But once I'm in front of them, I think to myself, why does this person think they're a good person? Like if they were a mob boss who killed somebody, that was in my article, The Godfather of Bangalore, I asked myself, why does this guy think that guy had to die? And then by thinking in that way, I get into their head a little bit, and then they just tell me why that guy had to die. And then, I'll get them on record being like, bang, 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 5 bullets, and I'm like, okay, wow. I got you. Right. So it's like, you have to empathize. You have to try to understand people. And some people, everyone thinks they're a good person. I mean, there's very few people who think that they are legitimately bad people. So if you're able to speak to them and then in some ways empathize with them, because, most of the world is not black and white. Most of the world is a gray area. When I talk to organ traffickers, and for my book, The Red Market, I was thinking to myself, this person doesn't think they're a murderer, right? Or an exploitator. They think that they are saving lives by giving organs to people who need them. And that's like, that's where all of this stuff gets very difficult to start understanding, because we don't live in a world where there's just good and evil. It's not like Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker, right? It's about like this really complex mix of messy humanness.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this invites just so many questions, but I want to get into the Enlightenment trap, because you wrote a book which typically when I get to interview somebody like you, I'll get the book and I can skim through it, get the main ideas. But the way you write, Scott, is just like, it's so engrossing that I basically spent my entire day reading the book. But it was quite an experience. And I think I want to start a little bit by laying out definitions for people, if it's okay with you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
When it comes to two terms that come up frequently, specifically when we're talking about spirituality and enlightenment, I think it's worth defining those two terms, because at least then we can set the path for people on where we're going to go with this conversation. So in your words, what is spirituality and what is enlightenment?
Just two impossible questions to start.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just going to give you the. It's just like, why don't we solve the Navier-Stokes equation here on this podcast?
So, spirituality is sort of this nebulous term that people use, where we talk about purposes that are greater than just the material realm. It's the realm of ethics. It's the realm of what is consciousness. In my word, but it's not necessarily formalized in sort of one particular religious tradition. You can be spiritual, but borrow from many, many different places. There is not one spirituality, right? There's many different ways that it comes together. And you can also be, say, Catholic and also be spiritual. It has to do with an open-mindedness, I believe, in my definition. And I think that probably many of your listeners think of themselves as spiritual people, if not, particularly religious. So it's sort of that non-dogmatic religious sense, a sense for something greater than oneself. Enlightenment has many, many meanings.
Yeah, it's
And
just one of those words where people throw it around all over the place and you never know where they're going with it. And so it's definitely worth sitting down and talking about this for a second.
so, in one formation of enlightenment, and this would be sort of a Western version of it, but also there's some versions of this in the East as well, which it's the idea that you have arrived at a perfect knowledge of the universe. And because you have that knowledge, you can bend the universe to your will. This is the hardest version of enlightenment. It's like a place you arrive through meditation, spiritual insight, or perhaps birth, and then you come out and you know the truth, capital T, both T's, the truth. And because of that knowledge, you're basically Neo in the Matrix. Okay, you with this knowledge comes great power, and you think of Jedi's, you think of the cartoon version of the Dalai Lama, Yoda, enlightened people because they have their magic powers. Now that version of enlightenment does exist in the Indic traditions. There are people who are said to be enlightened. The Buddha is said to be enlightened. The various divine beings, Shiva, Krishna, blah, 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 all those guys said to be enlightened. But there's another version of enlightenment that's also in those traditions, which is like enlightening, the idea that you are attempting to understand these things, and it is a journey that you will never achieve. And that's the version of enlightenment that I like. But I think that it is contested. It's contested in the Eastern traditions, and it's contested in the Western traditions. And in the United States, people who come from a Judeo-Christian background, by and large, I wasn't born into a Christian family, but I understand that our culture has a lot of Judeo-Christian elements in it. There's this idea that you get to heaven, right? There's this idea that if you're a good person, you act right in this world, you get to this heaven, which is a final state. It's not like there's heaven and there's heaven too, right? It's this place you go and then you're sort of done, and it's like a paradise or whatever it is. This is one formation of sort of like the journey that we are on. And I think that Americans in particular, but also to some degree the rest of the world, have this idea that enlightenment is also a final state, sort of like heaven. It's this idea that you can, especially if you mix it with this idea of the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism. In America, we really like working hard, and through our work, we become rich, right? And we have this idea that labor equals, success. When this gets applied to spirituality, you can pray so hard that you've come to heaven. You try to work hard on your ethics and go to heaven, or you apply this to the Eastern traditions. You get really, really good at meditation. You get really, really, really good at yoga, and then you achieve superpowers, essentially. You become Neo in the Matrix. You become Batman. I don't know if you know Batman's legend and Batman Begins. He starts off in Tibet. Sherlock Holmes goes to Tibet, comes back with superpowers. We have this idea that we go east, we work hard, or we find someone special, and we come back with knowledge that makes us somehow better than everyone else. And this is the crux of the Enlightenment trap. The book and the concept is that Enlightenment traps you in this idea of cessation, when the reality is that there is no state of enlightenment. Enlightenment is a process, and it is a process without an end. And the reason why we can factually know this is because if you gather up 30 people who say that they are enlightened, they don't agree on a gosh darn thing.
No. I think it's fascinating because, as you said, like even as I asked you that question, I think of how I look at that definition and sort of the freedom from the illusion of the self, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's somewhat, and that comes somewhat from, Sam Harris and some other people that I've spoke to in this world. And I tend to gravitate more towards that definition because there is a neuroscience component to it, the self, and especially now that we're having all these resumption of studies in psychedelics and looking into the default mode network, there does appear to be some sort of location of the self. And so maybe there is kind of, and again, this is somewhat of an assumption, and it's still being investigated, but it's a definition that I gravitated towards. But again, it's funny to me that if I were to ask you, or if I were to ask 20 other people on this podcast, what is enlightenment, it will be largely a different definition among those 20 people. And so this all begs the question, is spirituality a good thing? And where does it go wrong?
Is it a good thing? That's a fascinating question, because spirituality or any sort of ethical system assumes that it's trying to understand the good, right? Is like, what is good? Because it's very rare. I mean, there are some spiritual systems that are like, what is evil? Like, ripping out someone's heart and throwing it down a pyramid in Aztec. There's there's actually several dark shamanistic traditions out there. But in general, the idea in spirituality is, how do you be a good person? And I believe that spirituality can be a tool to get you to be a good person, because, this whole idea of the golden rule, do unto others as others do unto you, is a pretty good rule. And I feel like it's a spiritual rule. You could also put it into the reductionist paradigm, just being a good person generally helps prosperity or something. But I like the spiritual component to that. But the problem with spirituality is the concept of spiritual bypassing, wherein your spiritual definitions come to overrule the real world. And so when you go on the spiritual path, you run the risk of starting to think that what you are understanding sets you apart from other people instead of bringing you in closer with a community. So it's about a relationship more than it is about the concept, the large concept of spirituality. When I talk about meditation, I don't talk about it in good or bad. I talk about it as powerful. And it's powerful. In meditation, you can do things that you would not be able to do with normal consciousness, but it doesn't make you a good person for having achieved these things. And I think that's a definition that, honestly, people don't like this sort of discussion. People want to think that techniques that you practice will make you better, right? That if you're a yogi or a meditator or a devout Christian or a good Muslim or whatever, that these things that you do have answered that external question of you're a good person. You just follow these principles and then you get there. The reality is that life is hard and there are no answers. And where one person acts good does not mean that the effects are good. And a great example of this is my book on the red market. All of the organ traffickers I spoke to all thought they were making the world a better place because they were saving lives. They were providing organs to people whose organs were failing. And they saw that cells, probably to some degree, almost in a spiritual way, right? They would see themselves as good people because of what they were doing. I'm sure they profited, but capitalism isn't necessarily bad, they would think. And there's that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It's not the intentions that should be what you're looking at. It should be the effects of your intentions that you should be looking at, even though it's hard to have one without the other, right?
I want to bring in a character from your book, an actual person who passed away, Ian Thorson, and kind of talk a little bit about something you said there about how these processes can, in certain cases, bring us closer to people, and that may be quote unquote good, and in other cases bring us further apart. Now, when in the process of investigating Emily's death, you came across Ian. And so if you don't mind, can you go through how you came across him and, how it sort of exemplifies this idea of separation from the rest of humanity?
So I found Ian Thorson's story because I knew that I wanted to write a book on Emily O'Connor, who is the person who jumped off the roof in Bodh Gaya that we started this conversation with. And I knew that her story was part of a larger story of people going insane on their spiritual journeys, particularly in the Eastern traditions, even though it applies to all traditions. And I'd started collecting journals of different people who had either ended up institutionalized or dead on their spiritual journeys. And this was probably in I want to think that this was like 2011. I was really starting this work.
So you're collecting journals, and I'm just curious because, a lot of people listening to this may not have as much exposure to the Eastern traditions, may have limited exposure, may have heard of like the Beatles going to India or whatever, right?
Yeah, got a story about that too.
Yeah, and that's in the book as well. But when you're collecting books on the amount of people that have gone insane as a result of pursuing this, what kind of quantity are we talking about? Are we talking about 1, 2, 5, 10? What kind of journals are we talking
honestly,
about?
I haven't delved back through them in a while. I feel like I should, because I didn't actually publish on them because I didn't have permission for all of them. I think I had like 3 or 4 actual like written documents from people on their trips, which is honestly, that's a lot. That's a lot for this particular thing. And then I also spoke to not neuroscientists, psychiatrists in India and France who had seen a large number of people go to India and then become insane. So I had their accounts as well. And that was a story I published. I think it was ultimately in Details magazine, called like the Rise of India syndrome or something along those lines, which was about like literally there's this syndrome that was coined about people go to India and go crazy for a number of reasons that might happen. And as I was doing all of that research, Ian Thorson died while meditating on a mountaintop in Arizona while part of a neo-Tibetan Buddhist organization called Diamond Mountain University. And it seemed that his story and it's wild. His story is wild because it connects the coming of Tibetan Buddhism to North America, guru figures, or actually in this case, a Lama figure who declares enlightenment, who then ends up, like many people who declare enlightenment, believing that they have no peers. And then when you have no peers, you start to go crazy because there's no one who can tell you, maybe you're wrong. And like what all gurus do is all male gurus say, well, I have no peers and my penis is thinking this. And they all start having sex with their students. I mean, this is just what happens.
It's shocking to me. Like, it doesn't matter the tradition. Like, you have cases in both Tibetan Buddhism, Zen, Mahayana,
Christianity,
Christianity,
Islam.
of course, right? Like, it doesn't matter the tradition. It just seems like, okay, person in power who thinks he has no peers or has a sort of godlike status decides to use his penis in order to act in that God way. So
yeah, it is a pattern that we all recognize is there in a number of ways. But what happens is like you don't, there's no one else to tell you you're wrong. And then you're like, well, my young and sexy student is, into me. And then you use your power position. And so what this guy did, his name was Geshe Michael Roach. He took his 24-year-old student, Christy McNally, started having crazy tantric sex with her, and then declared that she was a goddess, a Tibetan goddess incarnate. And so what he was doing wasn't really sex. It was all about enlightenment, baby. And he does a 3-year silent retreat with her in Arizona. 3 years, no talking. And they're just like within 10 feet of each other the whole time. And she becomes a goddess in this Tibetan group. Ian Thorson, who's sort of on the outskirts of this, is sort of coming in and out of the group. He's becoming enraptured by the Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, which honestly, what Michael Roach teaches was great. Like I would say it's like 90% amazing. And that's like the Buddhist sutras. These are the open teachings of Buddhism. And he does it pretty well. Like I've sat through his lectures. I mean, he's a good sutra teacher. And sutras are great. It leads you introspection. It tells you how to be a good person. But then there's this flip side, which is the tantric secret teachings, which are
let's get, if you don't mind, Scott, can we give like a little bit more of a sense of the sutras? Because like for me, when I think of sutra, I'm thinking of the things that Mahayana Buddhism or even Theravada would say, like you're renouncing. wealth or greed or whatever it is? What were some of those and maybe I'm wrong, so please correct me what are some of those things that you heard in those sutras?
So the sutras are the open teachings, right? And so
Yeah.
this is so when Buddhism emerged in the about 2,800 years ago, it was a response to what was going on at that period in India. And I think it's really important to understand this. And at that point, you had these hardcore ascetics, people who would like starve themselves to death, and then you would have this intense greed, right? Like kings and whatnot. And both were considered spiritual paths. The kings were wealthy because it was their karma, and their karma said that they could be kings. And those aesthetics were like, we're getting rid of this world. This whole world is terrible. And so Buddhism came in as what is called the middle way, which was some renunciation, but not total renunciation of the body. To a person today, we would look at the type of Buddhism that the Buddha advocated as intense asceticism. But at that point, it wasn't. It was sort of an intermediary state between these two different ways of looking at what being good in the world would be like. And it involves looking at the mind. It involves meditation. It's sort of it's a technique to some degree. You sit, you want to watch your thoughts. You want to realize that reality is not what it appears to be, and that your senses frame the way the world works. And by lowering the stimulus that your body takes in through meditation and looking inwards at your mind, that is the way you can achieve reality. Another part of this is also reducing karma. So the idea of law of karma is that every action you do accrues or plants a karmic seed. So everything you do now has an effect in the future. And in Buddhism, what Buddha realized, supposedly, was that karmic seed, you've had an infinite number of past lives, and the karma of past lives plays out in this life now. So if you are, if you have a bad relationship with your father, it's because in a past life that, you were a bad parent to your son, for instance. Mm-hmm. And that plays out in this. So the karmic seed was planted and then it blooms in your life. That's sort of a general idea of the law of karma. And so the idea in sutras is you start stopping karma from happening in your life. You act neutral and you just watch the seeds pass. And by doing that over the course of several lifetimes, you will achieve a place of cessation and nirvana, and you'll get out of the cycle of suffering that is the world that we live in. That's sort of the mainstream Buddhist insight. Now, the Tantra is what is called like the warp speed to enlightenment, and that if you do Tantra, you can get rid of all your karma in one lifetime, and you do the exact opposite of what you do in sutras. Instead of tamping down on the emotions and things and becoming very quiet, you instead become very loud and realize in the loudness, in the intense anger, intense sexuality, intense sensational experiences, there is silence as well, and they're ultimately the same thing. But by going big, you can achieve things very powerfully, but it's also, they say, a very dangerous path. And I am a very suspicious of Tantra. In my book, The Enlightenment Trap, I talk about how Tantra even emerged in the first place in the Tibetan tradition. And I find it, it's sort of it's supposed to be a shortcut, right? But it's a shortcut by you acting like a mad person and like breaking all the rules and becoming honestly not a good person in the way you interact with other people. It feels like it's taking advantage of people in many cases. It feels like these techniques are unhinged from reality in many ways. And the reason for this is actually historical. The way I trace it in The Enlightenment Trap is that the sutras made it to Tibet in medieval period, right? And was it Songtsen Gampo? There was a Tibetan king who invited some Buddhists over, and he got some books of sutras and he put them in his library, and he forgot about them. And then a few kings later, they found these texts and they're like, hey, these sutras are great. We like being Buddhists. Maybe we'll become Buddhists. And but they didn't have many texts, so we need to go get more texts. So they sent emissaries to India. So, where Tibet is, sort of southern China, left side, Himalayas, and then the other side, we have the centers of Buddhism. They would send monks from Tibet to India. And in doing that, remember, this is a hard journey. You may not survive. You have to walk over the Himalayas.
The Himalayas are pretty freaking high, right?
Yeah, there's the mountains, there's the tigers, there's the bandits, and then you finally get to the centers of Buddhist learning, and the Indian monks are like, "Who are you, you redneck?" And they're mean to you. And it takes 7 years to learn Sanskrit or Pali. So you're really putting most of your life into this journey, and then you walk back. Again, you might die. Probably many of them did. And then you get these books and then you spread them around. But the reward is huge, because when you come back with texts from India, you become like the New York Times best-sellingest author ever in Tibet. They build monasteries too. You can go on lecture tours. Everyone sits and they give you butter sculptures and they put you on a pedestal. So it's a really like big prestige thing. And so the monks, over hundreds of years, they would send monks and they would come back, and eventually they translated all the sutras. Okay. And there were no more big books to do, but still the journey was hard. And there was a pressure from those Tibetan Buddhists to get more and more bestsellery books. Like, what happens when you run out of the mainstream books? Well, you get a little kooky, right? You get a little weirder. And so they started borrowing from the magic traditions in Buddhism, and the ascetics and the people who are practicing not Buddhism, but actually that ascetic Buddhism that Buddha sort of rejected. And he was the middle way, but now they're going after the people who say they can levitate, they can have sex until they become enlightened.
This is like Vajrayana Buddhism or something.
Correct. Okay. Correct. And they come back and they bring this, and those tantric texts become the next set of bestsellers in Tibet. And that's why Tibetan Buddhism is so intense compared to the other versions, right? It's so much more magical. It's so much more intense. It's so much more, enlightenment is a place you arrive at. And there's actually, there's these examples in Tibet and Bhutan, which also has Tibetan Buddhism in it, where this one monk, for a guy named Drukpa Kunle, who's the progenitor of what's called crazy wisdom, goes around, he has sex with all of the monks and all of the nuns and all of the princes and princesses. And he's like, "I'm showing you enlightenment, baby." And they still, to this day, paint his symbols on all of the walls of the Bhutanese monasteries. And you know it when you see it, because it's a giant erect phallus with spooge coming out of the tip of the penis. This is like in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and it's like just accepted. And Tibetan Buddhism just became very, very miracle heavy because of this print capital process that was happening in like the 1300s. Now, fast forward to the present day, or let's go to the 1800s. Westerners are starting with Marco Polo. They're like, "Oh, beyond the borders of Europe, there be dragons," right? And we know Europe's pretty sane, but there's going to be magicians if we just keep going east. And as like the colonialists and everyone starts exploring the world, the last place that's unexplored, that's inhabited, is actually the Himalayas. We explore, but when we go to the New World, we're like, where are the lost cities of gold, right? Where are the shamanistic, magicians? And there's some crazy stuff there. But then we say, oh, it's all mundane and they're all brutes. But there are magic people somewhere. And the last holdout for actually geopolitical reasons is Tibet. One, it's protected by the Himalayas. Two, the British don't want to have a direct frontier with China because of, they don't want to get into conflict with China. So Tibet was this great border area. But eventually, after they explored all of India and they found that there's no levitating people, they're like, well, they have to be in the Himalayas. And then we cast our interest towards the Himalayas. And it just so happened that the Tibetans had this really, really magical version of Tibetan Buddhism where they would say things like, we can levitate, we can walk through walls, we have telepathy, we have all these people, we have these Himalayan masters. And so we cast our imagination, starting with the Theosophical Society, if you've ever come across them, Madame Blavatsky, Henry Olcott, and Annie Besant, were these people who believed in scientific religion, which was theosophy, that all religions have some sort of like inherent truth. And they were going to compare all the different religions and find the ultimate truth. But what they were really doing was translating texts and coming up with their own like occult understanding of what the world worked with. And Blavatsky was one of these like standard issue kooky gurus, but she was like the first one. If you picture bright blue eyes, and she's over a crystal ball telling you your future. Like she's like that sort of prototypical soothsayer. And what she would do is she would wake up every morning and find letters in a basket at the foot of her bed by these so-called Mahatmas, the great souls that were in the Himalayas, that were telling her all of this secret knowledge, which of course she wrote these letters herself. But, she would take these things, and then she would also hire people to translate texts from India, from Tibet. And the first, like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bhagavad Gita, the Ramayana, all of these were first translated into English by that group, the Theosophical Society. So if you think about how we as Westerners look East, it is all through that
an occult lens.
Through an occult lens. And they're huge bestsellers in America because we want superpowers, right? We want there to be levitating monks somewhere in the world. And now everything we do when we try yoga or meditation or anything in the East, we're doing it also through the lens of that 1800s society. And it's so difficult to not have that, because that's the first thing that we learn, right? The first book I ever read about Indian religion was a book called Snowboarding to Nirvana. I don't even need to explain what it's about. You get the idea that this is like bullshit, right? The second book I read was Sorgil Rinpoche's Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, which is a very popular spiritual book. And that was also about the magic of Tibetans dying, how they understand how to die better than anyone because they have seen the true nature of death and enlightenment and reincarnation. And it's Buddhist, it's Tibetan Buddhist, but it plays up on those myths that come out of the East.
Mm-hmm. And how much of that, I assume part of this, similar to all of this discussion about mistranslations of the Bible, for instance, part of this has to be just like the mistranslation because the first person who did it had a very occult lens and maybe somewhat of a bias because they were looking for the Jetsons or, looking for Batman or Superman, right? So like how much of this do you think is really just a mistranslation at this point?
Well, I think we need to realize that the mistranslations, it's a mistranslation on mistranslation on mistranslation.
Yeah.
It's not just one, because this is also in the 1300s in Tibetan, in Tibet, right? And so I think it's a human thing. And also, what did the Buddha really do? I don't know. I don't have video. I don't have audio recordings of what he was all about. I know that people build up myths about spiritual people, right? I know that someone finds a guru who they love, and they're going to tell you how great that guy is. I cannot tell you much about the historical Jesus, right? But my guess is that the stories grew over time, okay?
Of course.
And there were conclaves of powers that come in, right? The church decides what texts are the legit texts and which one's a little too Mary Magdalene for me, right? So it's this field of hermeneutics. That's the question of translation, but it's also power and capital that are getting involved. And I think that in the West, we're like, hey, our traditions are messed up. And we sort of know that there are these conclaves and these like weird ulterior motives in our own tradition. But those Eastern traditions, those are pure. And that's the error, is that everything has a history. And Tibet Buddhism is no different. Old school Theravadan, Mahayana, none of these things are without the intervention of humans. Now, you could say that there are lineages, and there are many lineages of people who say that they go back to the Buddha. So 107 people back, this is from the words of the Buddha. But I don't know if you've ever played the game Telephone, but if I tell you, I think Boomer's great, and I tell 100 people to report the same thing.
It's going to come to me. It's going to be, I think Boomer's an asshole, or Scott thinks Boomer's an asshole, right? So
I mean, who knows? It's going to be like, okay, Boomer, where's my mushroom casserole? Like it may not even be related to anything. And I think the idea that there is an authentic wisdom is a problem, because in the reality is that we have to rediscover these things all the time. I don't know what the Buddha said. I can take some insights from the process of whatever he said, and I can learn new things. But ultimately, whatever spirituality is, isn't going to be some fundamentalist notion of what happened back then. It's going to have to do with how I experience something right now in my own modern context. Because even if the Buddha, even if that was the perfect translation that has come down, which I suspect it's not, it's still a medieval or even ancient context that has no bearing to what our own lives are like, or at least very little bearing, because the pressures that we have now, remember, the middle way was about kings and ascetics, and that was, and his tradition was like a bhakti tradition, which means sort of a reform to that particular context. And we know that that's what he was doing, right? We know that he was trying to talk about specific things in his time period, and now we try to put on an eternal note onto it. And there are kernels of things. Do be good to people. That's in Buddhism, right? Be good to people. But how you be good to people is the question, and we have to reinvent it every generation. I can't say something now that will be true forever. I can say that maybe if I meditate, some of those phenomenology will be the same, because I don't think our biology changes. If there is a spiritual realm, if we all have souls, let's say we do have souls, and let's say those souls are eternal, that may not be changing too much. But the context in which that soul interacts with the world does change. So yeah, that's where I am.
So let's go down back down that spirituality road, because we've been on it for a little while, but I want to talk specifically. So spirituality, and again, belief in something greater than yourself, we'll go with that definition here, and the pursuit of spirituality because somebody is probably trying to reduce the suffering in their life, right? Like maybe it's just the thoughts between their head or something of that nature. That doesn't seem inherently bad to me, but at some point, you're wandering down the yellow brick road, and you may deviate and end up on sort of the wrong path. And maybe you can bring out examples of the book on how people, like Ian did this, or Emily. What were some of the signs that they were on the wrong path? You mentioned earlier Tantra, and we had a little bit about Vajrayana Buddhism, but even Tantra, is it all bad? Or let's say, what were some of the warning signs specifically for Emily and for Ian that kind of popped up along the way?
Well, Emily happened very quickly. It happened over a 7-day period, and I was able to sort of document that through her journals. Like, she was prepared to some degree by studying yoga and whatnot in the West, but it really hit in this very short period where she
was in Charlottesville, right? Like I think that was what it said in the book. And she was doing yoga in Charlottesville, like dyes her hair red. And then she goes on this trip and bam, very quick.
Yeah. She was like a normal, awesome type A college student, really driven, really smart. And I think it's actually the type A personality that might be in the most danger, because they really believe in their efforts. And then she had this experience in meditation, and she's like, wow, this is the answer. And then her journal gets weird. Like, it starts saying, like, I know all of the ancient texts intuitively in my soul, and all I have to do is like reach down and grab it. And like, she has sort of these sorts of statements, but she comes to believe that she's enlightened. And then she takes her own life because she wants to stay there in one way or another. And that's my reading of her journal. Ian is a little different because his journey takes place over about 15 years, maybe 20 or 15 years, depending on how you want to calculate it. And with him, which is a more typical type of story, he is seeking something. He wants something good, and he wants to find a meaningful existence. And eventually he meets somebody who says, I can give you a meaningful existence because I know the real reality. And here's a technique that you can do. And then at some point, he starts to believe that the teachings of this teacher, Geshe Michael Roach, are so profound that they're more important than the material reality that we live in. He starts to believe that spiritual insights are the only thing that matters. And this is what psychiatrists call spiritual bypassing. It's like when everything is a sign of something greater than the world. So like a classic spiritual bypassing example is like, let's say I'm getting in a fight with my wife, maybe she wants to divorce me, and my dog got hit by a car, right? And all of these things are terrible and bad. I just want to talk to my friend about it. And then the friend comes and is like, oh, I get it, Mercury's in retrograde right now. And then
I was at a party in Hollywood and somebody brought that up and I just started laughing. Mercury. Anyway,
right, because it's like this idea that there's this other clockwork to the universe that person knows and you don't, and the actual like legitimate cause and effect that we can detect in the real world is irrelevant because that person knows the true answer. And that's what Ian got caught up in. And once you get into this type of philosophical hole, you cannot get out of it, because everything the guru says is a reflection of the ultimate reality. And you either have to trust them or you police the boundaries of that reality with your own consciousness. And you're like, well, I am actually an emanation of the goddess Vajra Yogini, and therefore I need to understand it from her perspective. And like and they even in their meditations, they start pretending they're goddesses in a very intensive type of meditation that he did, where he said he was the goddess. He envisioned himself with breasts and with, multiple limbs. And he does these things and literally to become this other thing. And he's trying to like blend the mythical world with the real world. And as he does this, he loses his friends. He loses his family. He starts to be not adapted to the world around him. He can't handle stressful things in the world, because to handle stressful things, you have to act in the world. And if you think that your spiritual meditations are what's getting you out of it, you're not acting in the world correctly. So the world seems like it's going out of control. And then you go delve deeper and deeper into your own spiritual understandings. And this ended with him dying of dehydration in the arms of Lama Christy McNally in Arizona, like where he is dying of dehydration.
After she stabbed him, right?
After she stabbed him, because
and she claimed she was invoking Kali, which is the goddess of destruction. There's a lot of red flags in this story, Scott. There's like a handful. If you were to since you've done the work on kind of evaluating a lot of these people who have maybe made the wrong turn on the spiritual path, and as a person, like at least in my explorations in this, I've been very fortunate in the people that I've met in terms of it doesn't seem like they've wanted to take advantage of me or anything like that, right? What were some of are there like common warning signs other than, it seems like isolation certainly is one. Yep. But what were some of the other ones you've kind of noticed?
I mean, isolation is an enormous one, right? It's like when you start withdrawing because your spiritual insights are more important than than the real world relationships. That's the bad sign. Also hallucinations, depersonalization, techniques. A typical thing that a cult will do will take up all of your time with various moral reckoning. In Ian's case, he had to keep a notebook telling everything that he did that was a possible karmic sin of various ways. And so he would like check off in this little blue notebook, well, I thought an impure thought, and check, that's one karmic seed that, he has to deal with later. And so
sounds like another religion I've heard of too.
Yeah.
A handful of them, actually.
I mean, it's a very culty method of keeping control of your flock, right? Is like they become self-policing. Another thing is the idea of lying. Lying is a big problem in these organizations because all of them that I know of have the open teaching, which is that you should never lie. Like you should love everyone and you should never lie. That's like a standard. But then they'll have a second teaching, was that it's even that the community is more important than any other thing that you might do. So you can lie if it serves a greater purpose. So it's this weird thing. It's called upaya in Sanskrit, which is the idea of skillful means. Is that it's sort of like Machiavelli. Well, I want everyone to be enlightened, but they can't all know the truth about how I'm fucking all of my students. So we have to tell them that I'm not fucking my students, and that if I am fucking them, it's for their enlightenment. Wink, wink. That's upaya. And that the students, when asked by a journalist, is he fucking you? they have to say, oh, no, we just get very deep spiritual teachings. Like that's the sort of thing that happens. And then these lies become self-policing, and you create this alternate reality where you have the insider knowledge and the outsider knowledge. And we see this not only in the groups that I'm writing about in the Enlightenment trap, but we see this in all religious communities. We see this in the wellness community. We see this like everywhere where we have this internal policing, and we also have in our political spectrum in the United States, right, where we have the self-policing, this idea that personally, I'm a liberal, right? I'm on the left side of things. But there's things as a liberal can't say that criticizes liberals, because then you're an evil conservative person, even if the liberals are sometimes insane. Like, and it's that sort of self-policing, but then you take us to another degree when you get into this sort of more culty type of thinking.
Okay, so there's something in there that you said, which was, I know the real reality. And you follow this guru, and you find this guru because you're naturally a seeker and you're looking for the answer. And then somebody comes to you and says, hey, I've got it. Let's transition this a little bit to the health world now. Because I think there is a danger in how our health world has progressed. And maybe it's been there for a while and I just haven't realized it, where you have these figureheads out there that say, you know, and for all intents and purposes, people usually get into health because they've screwed themselves up. They're trying to fix some sort of situation. Maybe they were naturally an athlete, and so they were doing it from the start. But for the most part, most of the people I've met in this world are trying to fix something. And so they find these people who say, I know the answer.
Right.
Do we have parallels right now between these sort of cultish guru types and the health world? And what are some of those parallels that you've observed? Because you've been in this health world for almost as long as I have, if not longer. So I'd love to hear what you think.
It's the exact same thing, right? And it is that same question of upaya. It's the same question of, I know the ultimate reality, and you are going to follow me, wink, wink. And maybe we'll self-experiment. Maybe that's the way we'll talk about it. We'll self-experiment on ourselves. But, you know, you don't get a person like, let's use the caricature. Let's use Liver King. Okay. Liver King goes out there.
Timely one, right?
Yeah, right. Liver King goes out there and is like, you can look just like me if you eat liver, right? And you live an ancestral lifestyle. You throw spears at deer, whatever the hell he was doing, right? He becomes his character.
Inject yourself with testosterone.
Right. But he presents an idea that's untested, right? You know, they gesture towards science, but science generally doesn't catch up with this stuff, isn't there yet. They're like, there is science, they'll say like peptides, or you have peptides in you need more peptides. That's what's hot like today is peptides.
Yeah.
But the thing is that we might have some interesting studies on mice, and maybe 12 people did this control trial that was promising, or, you know, you recorded that, hey, that meditation practice released dopamine. Everyone loves dopamine. Therefore, follow my health
We should
plan.
do that meditation practice.
Yeah. Yeah. Therefore, hey, someone did some science, and the science is like basically meaningless because everything releases dopamine, right? And then you're like, oh, I need to do this thing in order to optimize. And they'll use this bro optimization talk. And then they'll say that they have the recipe somehow. Where'd they get it from? No one knows, because they're just futzing with stuff. And then they create a supplement line, and then an online training course. And all of a sudden you're joining to become a level 2 trainer in whatever method that is. And you end up in the same sort of upaya insanity, because here's the other thing, is that there's a sunk cost to this. If you become a person who believes, a random health guru who thinks that you should be grounded on earth, and that EMF is splitting your DNA like a fractal, and then you change your house and you spend $40,000 to change your house to become non-EMF, there's no way at that point that you're going to be like, I think I was a little crazy here. The only thing you can do is double down, right? The only thing you can do is like, well, and not only EMF, it's also vaccines, and there's a child pornographer who's going after my kid because it's so hard to walk back. Like, And honestly, we punish people who walk back. If you
Yeah.
in our society apologize for something that you did, everyone's like, "Oh my God, you are a horrible person." But if you double down, we don't go after those people as much, right? Where that person's crazy, they'll say, but their followers who are with them already are already on that same path. They've already doubled down, and this is like a problem in rhetoric in the world in general, is that we don't want to think that we can make mistakes, right? If anyone walks back something, at one point it was coconut in your coffee, right? It was MCT oil. That's going to make your brain optimal. Now it's peptides, and soon it's going to be, you're going to have to hook yourself up to a Faraday cage. I don't know where it's going to go, but it's like these ideas of adding things on, like, yeah, what I said over then was true too, but I'm going to make it even better now. So you can forget that stuff and look at my new stuff. And you don't see people apologize, and you don't see uncertainty in the world. It's the person who can declare with most certainty that they are right. That person wins. In the rhetorical,
if you say you're uncertain or it depends or anything like that, which is what, and there's a few scientists we've had on the podcast who they speak like that, but you don't have for some reason people don't gravitate towards that. There's no gravitas in that, and so therefore your following is less, and therefore you make less money, and so people as a result then reinforce the process, right? Which is
exactly,
I have the framework that works for you and follow me.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is why I'm never going to be famous. And I was thinking about this the other day, is that the rule of social media in particular, I mean, I think there was a world where this has been a fundamental thing all the time, but it was a little less adrenalized before social media.
It's just social media kicked on steroids, right? Especially with some of these algorithms. So tell me more about social media and how that's impacting everything. So
the rule of social media is the same as the rule of improv, right? Because we're already off script. Like, we don't have the science to back up like a tenth of the claims that is made on social media. But what you do is, the rule of improv is yes and. As in, someone gives you a statement, and then you say, yes, you're right, and here's my other statement. And so if someone says to you, peptides are the new thing, you say, yes, I love your peptides protocol. Also, look at my new bull testosterone protocol. These two things work together great. And so you just build on bullshit. Someone lays down a piece of bullshit, and you put your bullshit on top of it. And now 2 social media followings are agreeing that you have to inject your bullshit with peptides and then eat it. And then and then both people's followings grow. The issue that I have is that I'm not a yes and person. I'm like a wait, is that true sort of person, which
or you're a no and person. I've had conversations with you separately, so
sure. But I mean, sometimes I have evidence, and sometimes I'm just like, wait a minute, let's hold up here, because sometimes the things you're saying, such as peptides are going to be the next big thing, is actually a little bit wrong. Like, how can the person who says you have to inject testosterone, because testosterone is the other big thing right now, right? Every male is like, I'm getting older, therefore my testosterone is going down.
TRT,
I need higher
right?
If I have higher TRT, that means I'm going to be a better person in general. And there's multi-million-dollar businesses, $100 million businesses that inject you with T. But we don't know like half of what T actually does. And we do know that the body is full of many, 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 many hormones, many, many, many chemicals and subchemicals, precursors, and all this stuff. And it is hubris to believe that one thing is the master and controller of it all. But what sells is that I can give you the one thing. And there will be an effect. Testosterone has an effect, but we don't know what it does in the long term, really. We don't know what injecting T really does to you. Except there are some indications that it's really bad. And
could
also we know that
overconfidence and cause you to, do things crazy like divorce your wife or something like this.
Or physically fall apart, And like, also the idea that someone with high T is necessarily a better performer does not bear out when you actually test high performers who have sometimes very low T. And then you pathologize this. And it's like, it becomes like you're reading tea leaves. Like, this is the problem with functional medicine, is that there are some good things about functional medicine, the idea that we want to treat the whole person at once. But what they actually do is they medicalize it. They take a blood panel, they look at 100 chemicals that they can identify. And honestly, there's a lot of chemicals that aren't identified by names. It's like when we give it a name, we're like, oh, that's the one. I've given it a name now.
Yeah.
But you've named it, and then you're like, well, I'm going to read this like tea leaves, because science can tell you what one thing might do, right? Or maybe two things might do. But reductionism cannot and has no ability to tell you what 100 things do and how they all interact together, because that's not how randomized controlled trials gain knowledge. We can't get that information. And yet these guru figures come up and say that they can read that. They say that I know. And so put your faith in me, put your faith in somebody who has a lab coat or a successful podcast. I know. And it's a cult of personality. Then people are playing with their biology.
I think there's a couple of things I want to point people to, because I'm going to ask you a couple of other questions, but for further information on this stuff, we've had Thierry Hertog, who is a pretty famous endocrinologist, come in and talk about, he's been on the podcast separately to talk about the whole network of hormones. And if you want sort of an alternative view to TRT, I would point people to that episode. And then the other one is on metabolomics, and that was one of our first podcast episodes here. There is, when you take the unit of selection down to the cell and focus strictly onto the cell, there is some possibility to look at those in a slightly more, I don't really want to use the term complex systems because that's a little bit too trendy, but you can start to look at them in sort of a network, and that produces a realm of nutrient balancing, which could be interesting for people. Now, because we're going along this realm of gurus, Scott, I need to talk a little bit about a particular situation that you've got yourself into lately. And, you know, I don't know them personally. I was one of, similar to you, an early adopter to the Wim Hof method. And I think actually your book was the one that turned me on to the Wim Hof method a little bit more than, you know, whatever $50 app I bought from them at that time. And I had a good experience on the Wim Hof method at that time. It's changed.
Hold on,
What's
my
that?
cat needs something.
Yeah.
All right, get out. Run. Okay. Continue.
So the Wim Hof method has, of course, evolved over time. It's become very, very popular. And we have a number of people probably listening to this show that have either done it or certainly heard of it. Can you talk to me a little bit about your experience with Wim, how it's helped you, and then sort of how you think where they may have gone off the path, so to speak, to keep the theme of the show?
So yeah, after writing The Enlightenment Trap, I heard about Wim Hof, this ice guru who said he can make your body do superhuman things. And I was like, that's bullshit. And I got a commission from Playboy to go out there and basically debunk him as a false prophet. The problem is that it worked. In a week, I was doing all the things, the breath work, you know, ultimately reversed an autoimmune condition I had. Like, it was...
Helped me recover from burnout. So like there is some legit experience with it. Yeah.
It's legit awesome. Like, and I stand by that even to this day. But read What Doesn't Kill Us. It is the rah-rah cheerleader. I still believe everything in that book. I have been a practitioner of the Wim Hof method for 10 years, and I love it, and I love the community of people around it. However, I have gotten into some trouble lately because I have been worried that the Wim Hof method is sort of going off the rails. And there are a number of reasons for this. First, let me tell you, my guilty part is that in What Doesn't Kill Us and in my other writings, I'm basically saying that Wim is not a cult and he's a great guy, right? Is not like these methods work and you should do it too. And that's why that book has sold like 250,000 copies. Big deal. What I did when I was writing it, though, is that I intentionally, just like pretty much everyone else who has written about Wim Hof, did not tell the full story of the man. I did not tell, I mean, I think I did more of this than other people, but like Wim is a madman and a prophet, right? He is a guy who does things that are irresponsible, that are dangerous, that could have gotten me killed. At the last chapter in What Doesn't Kill Us, he almost gets me and him killed while we're climbing up Mount Kilimanjaro without our shirts on. And I'm like, there's some dangerous things here. And I'm sort of this cautionary tale. But there were whole sections in What Doesn't Kill Us that I took out at the request of my editor and the Wim Hof team, because they were like, this makes him look too bad. Like, I minimized the fact that he was an alcoholic, that he was a smoker. I didn't tell the story of him giving himself a near fatal enema, where he swam out into the middle of a fountain and put his rectum right on the fountain, and then it spurted through all of his intestines like a water knife, and he almost died. Like, that's a thing that happened.
I shouldn't laugh, but like, dear God, wow.
Right. It's a thing. And the reason I didn't do that is but who's going to follow the advice of this madman when this happens? And everyone knows these stories out here. I didn't tell the story of what a terrible father he was, how he has like 5 or 6 kids with different women, and he abandoned his family for 10 years, so that they had to raise themselves in a squat house in Amsterdam. I didn't tell these stories because I wanted to push up the method. And I think it's not just me. It's like every journalist who gets out there, we all become protective of Wim, right? We become protective of him. And meanwhile, he rises up in international stardom. People are like, oh, he's a perfect guy. Like, he knows it. He saved my life. His method is so good. We'll never throw him under the bus. And I think we've gotten to a point now where now he has millions of followers on YouTube and Instagram. He's got so many celebrity friends, Oprah, Russell Brand, and all this stuff. And we're not talking about how he's talking about the New World Order and how the pharma companies are all trying to kill us, and how Fauci should be put in jail. I mean, he's repeating that. And like, I think he's even going into the child molester stuff sometimes. He is off he's not a perfect person. And what I'm trying to put out is that the Wim Hof method is great. I love it. And we can talk about a gray area right now. And for saying this, I have now been attacked by like everyone. I put out a YouTube video that then was like, Einam Hof, who's the son of Wim Hof, issued like 10 or 15 copyright strikes on my, when you do a video of Wim Hof, you show him jumping into the water, right? Like, and everyone does this. And if you Google my journey with Wim Hof by anyone, you'll see the same clips. And I use some of those clips in my stuff. Every single video I ever had that mentioned anything about Wim Hof was taken down by copyright strikes. Because, I mean, I was considering it fair use, but maybe there's a point there. But it wasn't taken down because I was wrong, like, because for a legitimate reason. It was very specifically to shut me up. And then I did these videos about like their business practices, how people are upset by it. And I've been trying to get this information out, and I keep on getting attacked. I get lawsuit threats, all of these things, because I'm trying to tell the truth. More recently, I'm talking about the problems with shallow water blackout, where people hyperventilate. They do the Wim Hof method in water and then they drown, which is, there are warnings on Wim Hof's site why you shouldn't be doing this. I get it, and that's good that those warnings are there. But then Wim Hof, I have videos of him teaching that like last week, like sitting there, hyperventilated in water. They've all put like 30 people have put their faces in water. So why is he teaching these techniques? I think we need to remember that Wim is a madman. We need to moderate our expectations of him, because he goes off book. He is not a perfect person. And yet now the community is very divided. Some people think that I'm out here to make money on this. Like, I'm doing this because I'm a greedy journalist. And, I'm not making any money. All I'm doing is getting threats and getting attacked and losing. I should be the person who's yes-anding him. I should be like, yeah, Wim is great, and you should do
Here's another breath technique for you.
Yeah. That's the way I get rich. Instead, what I'm trying to do is like, no, let's stop and let's think about this and think clearly, because there is some dangerous stuff. And I'm worried that I am going to be the person who both made Wim Hof and the person who's ultimately going to put the brakes on him. And I don't dislike him. I still like Wim. I still love the method. I still practice it every day, but it's going off the rails.
So I want to kind of bring us back here to the guru concept. And I think, I believe you said in your book, guru is a Sanskrit term. And I can't remember if that's actually correct or not. But gurus, is it an outdated concept? Is it something that we've outgrown as a society? And if it is, what is there to replace it?
So the word guru, which means teacher, essentially, is the word outdated? I don't know. Sure, yes, no. I don't necessarily. It's Sanskrit, so it's old. Like whatever.
Yeah.
Influencer could be also guru, but I think I think one term which is useful to translate for you is that guru is the person, but but the other way that we say this is guru siksha, which means the teacher and the student. And it's really in the Indic traditions, it's about the relationship of how the student accepts a guru and basically gives over all of the control in their life over to the guru. A lot like the apprentice system in the Western tradition, but also the idea of becoming indebted to them in a way that is spiritual and sort of deep. That is something that certainly happened with Ian Thorson. And it happens in a lot of cults. You'll take vows of like fealty to certain people. It's not super common in America, right? You have to get really into yoga before you actually find a guru who takes control of your life. I think that. And what happens in the influencer culture, you're not declaring fealty to a person. Yeah. What happens is it's a sunk cost. You start following them, and then if you break with that community, you look like a fool. So you better just go and double down on it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then how do we fix this whole sunk cost fallacy thing? Because that's something that is inherently human nature, right? Like we've gone and invested thousands of dollars following XYZ influencer, and now we're coming to find that maybe there's an alternative, like maybe vegetables are good or something like this.
Yeah, right. And who knew?
And maybe eating a balanced diet is a good idea. Yeah. You come to that position. Is there a way to break with that in terms of human nature? And what would you foresee as the path forward? Because it doesn't seem like we're going to get rid of TikTok anytime soon.
There's two ways forward. One way is we as a society can become okay with people being wrong sometimes, right? We can accept, and I do this, like if someone says they're wrong, I'm like, cool, I get it. And like, it's fine. And embrace the idea that there are gray areas and no one has one answer, and there's actually usually 50 answers. That is just something that we all need to like inhabit in ourselves. However, if you are a sunk cost person and you're already on the path of madness and find yourself backing up the weirdest things that your guru is to say, you're like, I guess I have to go with Russell Brand all the way down QAnon. You can, instead of just straight up breaking with them, publicly, you can just be like, maybe I'll follow somebody else. Maybe I'll try a different idea. And then you can just let go a little bit. Like it's not the path that I take. I take the hard path and I'm like, I made an error. Let's go fix it. But there's no reason you have to, right? The strategy can just be like, hey, let's look a little deeper into these things and
hear the other side of the argument, right? It's because this is a conversation that could be had about politics or any number of different topics, right? There's just an interjection of even 1% of different influence may help steer the ship or the asteroid away from the near Earth collision, right?
Totally. And like, I'm very much in the liberal camp of things, right? But I can also look at some of the things that the conservative camp says, like, some of that makes sense. And it's because that not everyone is right all the time and not everyone is wrong all the time. There is no 100% correlation to correctness. Like even someone like Mussolini was, probably said some stuff that was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. That was a good plan, right? And like Trump, I really didn't like Trump. Some of his foreign policy ideas actually bore out and weren't terrible. And I think that it's important to realize that groupthink is idiotic. Like when everyone is saying the same thing, there is no way that those people can be right. And groupthink often leads down to self-policing. It's where you get into a place where you're like, I can't even talk about this subject because I feel one way, but I know that if I mention that my controversial feeling does on, say, Twitter, I'll get 40,000 people telling me what a bad person is and how I want to, like, I don't know, put Jews in concentration camps, right? Like, it will get blown out to a degree which is insane. And that is a problem. And yeah, I mean, there's a great book called The Coddling of the American Mind, which is like how the left self-polices and even endorses violence and does these things, which are very counterproductive and leads to polarization. I mean, I can talk about all of that on the conservative side very effectively too. But if we don't see it in ourselves, then what are we really doing? Are we being good people, or are we just like spiritually bypassing because we don't want to have a conflict?
We've come full circle on the spiritual bypassing. I think this is a great place to pause this conversation. I'm sure we're going to have another one, Scott.
Sounds good.
Final question for you. Mm-hmm. 3 pieces of advice for anyone listening right now so that they can live smarter, not harder.
3? I have to get 3 pieces of advice?
I mean, if you want to give one, we can leave it with one, but 3 is a good way to start.
Get out and trust realize that your sensations are giving you a choice, and sensations are like either from the physical world, as in like you're hot or you're cold, or your emotional responses. That is information that you can watch from a depersonalized perspective and then realize you have a choice. That's super important. Next one, question your gurus, question the people who you love. They can be wrong. And that's important to know. Third, I don't know, read all Scott Carney's books because they're great. I don't know.
As I said, specifically, I like audiobook of What Doesn't Kill Us. Fantastic. The Wedge, I have fun playing those games. And then the Enlightenment Trap, I told you, like I tend to skim a lot of books in order to prepare for podcasts, and he wrote this damn book that I had to actually read. And so, because you write in a way that it forces you to flip to the next page and the next page and the next page. So thank you for taking up an entire day for me.
Yeah. It's always great to hang out with you. I liked you coming by Denver, and I hope we get to chat again soon.
Absolutely. Scott, my friend, thank you so much. Have an absolutely awesome day.
You too, man.
Thank you again for tuning in for that conversation with Scott Carney. As a reminder, if you tuned into this on Apple Podcasts, please subscribe to the podcast, but also leave a 5-star rating and a comment. We read them all. If you're on Spotify, a 5-star rating certainly helps, and please don't forget to subscribe. And if you're on YouTube, click like and subscribe right now. Thank you so much for tuning in once again to the Smarter Not Harder podcast, your home to 1 cent solutions to life's $64,000 questions. Have a great day.